At 1 p.m. on April 5, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Takashige Egusa rolled his Aichi D3A dive bomber inverted 10,000 feet above the Indian Ocean, 200 miles southwest of Ceylon. Below him, two British heavy cruisers, HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire, steamed desperately toward safety at 27 knots. Behind Egusa, 79 more Vals dive bombers followed him into attack position. In the next 20 minutes, these aircraft would execute the most accurate dive bombing attack in naval history, achieving over 80% hit rates while descending at near vertical angles that Western pilots considered suicidal. The dive angle was 85 degrees, nearly straight down. At that angle, an aircraft accelerates rapidly toward terminal velocity. Without effective dive brakes, pilots lose control. The aircraft becomes a projectile, not a bomber. Pullout becomes impossible. The dive becomes suicide. American and British dive bomber doctrine limited dive angles to 70 degrees maximum for this exact reason. Steeper dives were considered uncontrollable and fatal. But Japanese dive bomber pilots had perfected a technique that defied Western assumptions. They dove at 80-85 degrees routinely, sometimes approaching 90 degrees, completely vertical. They maintained complete control throughout the dive. They released bombs with pinpoint accuracy. They pulled out safely at under 1,000 feet altitude. And they did this while achieving hit rates that no other nation's dive bombers could match. Between April 5th and April 9th, 1942, during the Indian Ocean raid, Japanese Vals dive bombers would sink one aircraft carrier, two heavy cruisers, one destroyer, one corvette, and over 40 merchant ships. Total tonnage, approximately 150,000 tons. Total aircraft lost to combat, 0. Not a single Vals was shot down by enemy fighters during dive bombing attacks. The suicide dive proved to be the safest, most effective naval strike tactic of the early Pacific War. How did an aircraft with fixed landing gear, a maximum speed of only 240 mph, and a design dating to 1936 dominate the most modern warships on Earth? How did pilots flying near vertical dives achieve 80-90% hit rates when the historical average for dive bombing was 10 to 15%? The answer lay not in technology, but in a combination of innovative engineering, fanatical training, and tactical doctrine that prioritized accuracy over every other consideration. This is the story of the Aichi D3A Vals, the aircraft that American intelligence dismissed as obsolete in 1941, then watched helplessly as it sank more Allied tonnage in 6 months than any other weapon system in the Pacific. This is the story of pilots who trained for 3 years to perfect a diving technique that Western aviators refused to attempt. And this is the story of the Indian Ocean raid, when 180 Vals dive bombers demonstrated what obsolete aircraft could accomplish in the hands of master pilots. The Aichi D3A's development began in mid-1936 when the Imperial Japanese Navy issued Specification 11-SHU calling for a new carrier-based dive bomber to replace the aging Aichi D1A biplane. The specification demanded an aircraft capable of carrying a 550-pound bomb, achieving 200-plus mph speed, operating from aircraft carriers with limited deck space, and executing steep dive bombing attacks with high accuracy. 3 companies submitted designs: Aichi, Nakajima, and Mitsubishi. Each received contracts to build 2 prototypes. At Aichi, chief designer Tokichiro Gowaki studied every dive bomber design he could obtain. He was particularly interested in 2 German aircraft, the Heinkel He-70, which had beautiful elliptical wings providing excellent aerodynamics, and the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, which featured revolutionary dive brakes that allowed controlled steep dives. Gowaki decided to combine the best features of both designs while adding Japanese innovations. The Aichi design featured low-mounted elliptical wings similar to the Heinkel. The wing design provided excellent lift characteristics and good handling at low speeds, critical for carrier operations. But the wings included a crucial innovation: perforated dive brakes mounted on the underside, rotating 90 degrees to create massive drag during dives. These weren't simple flaps. They were blade-like structures extending well below the wing surface on 3 rotating arms. When deployed, they created enough drag to limit dive speed to approximately 370 kilometers per hour, 230 mph, regardless of dive angle. This was revolutionary. The Ju-87 Stuka's dive brakes were effective, but limited dive angles to approximately 60-70 degrees. The Aichi's dive brakes were far more effective, allowing dive angles of 80-85 degrees while maintaining controllable speed. Steeper dives meant shorter time exposed to anti-aircraft fire, more accurate bomb delivery, and better ability to penetrate heavy AA defenses. But there was a problem. Gok's first prototype, completed in December 1937 and test flown in January 1938, had serious issues. The aircraft was underpowered, unstable in turns, and the dive brakes vibrated violently at speeds above 230 mph. Test pilots reported the aircraft was dangerous and unsuitable for carrier operations. Gok went back to the drawing board. Between February 1938 and November 1939, he redesigned the tail section, enlarged the horizontal stabilizer, added a long dorsal fin extending from mid-fuselage to the tail, strengthened the dive brakes, and increased engine power from 710 horsepower to 1,000 horsepower using the Mitsubishi Kinsei 43 radial engine. The improvements transformed the aircraft. Instability disappeared. The dive brakes stopped vibrating. Maneuverability improved dramatically. In December 1939, the Imperial Japanese Navy ordered the aircraft into production as the Navy Type 99 Carrier Bomber Model 11, designated D3A-1. The Allies would codename it VAL. The production D3A-1 had the following specifications: length 33 feet 5 inches, wingspan 47 feet 2 inches, height 12 feet 7 inches, empty weight 5,309 pounds, maximum takeoff weight 8,047 pounds. The aircraft was powered by a single Mitsubishi Kinsei 43 9-cylinder radial engine, producing 1,000 horsepower at 2,400 RPM, driving a 3-bladed variable pitch propeller. Maximum speed at 9,145 feet was 240 miles per hour. Cruising speed was 184 miles per hour. Service ceiling was 3,500 feet. Combat range was 9 or 15 miles. The crew consisted of 2: pilot in the forward cockpit, observer, radio operator, rear gunner in the rear cockpit. Armament included 2 fixed forward-firing Type 97-7, 7mm machine guns mounted in the engine cowling with 600 rounds per gun. 1 flexible Type 92 7.7mm machine gun in the rear cockpit operated by the observer with 600 rounds. Bomb load consisted of 1 250-kilogram, 550-pound bomb mounted on a centerline trapeze under the fuselage, plus 2 60-kilogram, 130-pound bombs on wing racks. The centerline trapeze was ingenious. It swung the bomb forward and downward, clear of the propeller arc when released. But specifications don't explain the VAL's effectiveness. Many aircraft had similar specs. What made the VAL deadly was the training system that produced its pilots and the tactical doctrine they employed. Japanese naval aviator training in the late 1930s was the most demanding in the world, and understanding this system is essential to understanding why VAL dive bombers achieved results that seemed impossible to Western observers. The Japanese naval aviation training pipeline began with the Yokurin, the Flight Reserve Enlisted Trainee Program. Boys as young as 14, 15 years old could apply. The entrance examination tested mathematics, science, physical fitness, eyesight, and general intelligence. In 1936, approximately 15,000 boys applied for 1,500 available slots. Acceptance rate, 10%. Those accepted entered a 3-year program that would transform them into naval aviators or kill them trying. Year 1 focused on basic military training, physical conditioning, and academic studies. Trainees studied navigation, meteorology, aircraft engines, radio operation, and basic aerodynamics. Physical training was brutal. 5-mile runs before breakfast, swimming in full uniform, judo and kendo martial arts, obstacle courses designed to test endurance and courage. Punishment for mistakes was harsh. Physical beatings by instructors were common and accepted as part of the training culture. Approximately 30% of candidates washed out during Year 1. Year 2 introduced actual flight training. Trainees started with the Yokosuka K-5Y Willow biplane trainer, a 2-seat aircraft with a maximum speed of 132 km/h. Initial flight instruction covered basic maneuvers, takeoffs, landings, straight and level flight, turns, climbs, descents. After approximately 10 hours of dual instruction, trainees soloed. But soloing was just the beginning. The real training started afterward. Trainees progressed through increasingly difficult maneuvers: loops, rolls, spins, inverted flight, formation flying, navigation flights, night flying. Another 20–30% washed out during Year 2 due to inability to master flight skills or fear-related failures. Year 3 specialized training for different aircraft types: fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, or reconnaissance aircraft. Dive bomber trainees transferred to the Aichi D3A biplane dive bomber for initial dive bombing instruction. This is where the casualty rate increased dramatically. Dive bombing was the most dangerous form of naval aviation training. Trainees learned to dive at progressively steeper angles: 40 degrees, 50 degrees, 60 degrees, 70 degrees, eventually 80–85 degrees. Each increase in dive angle increased the risk of structural failure, control loss, or inability to pull out. Between 1936 and 1941, approximately 15% of dive bomber trainees died in training accidents, mostly from structural failures during pullouts or from pulling too many G-forces and blacking out. The survivors became extraordinary pilots. By the time a dive bomber pilot graduated and received assignment to a fleet carrier squadron, he had logged approximately 800–1,000 flight hours, including 200–300 hours of dive bombing practice. He had executed over 500 practice dive bombing attacks. He could dive at 85 degrees, maintain precise control, compensate for wind and target motion, release bombs accurately, and pull out safely while pulling 5G forces. He could do this in any weather, day or night, with or without instrument reference. This level of training was unmatched by any other nation. American dive bomber pilots in 1941 averaged 250 and 400 total flight hours. British pilots averaged even less. The tactical doctrine employed by Vals pilots was equally sophisticated. Japanese dive bomber tactics emphasized coordination, surprise, and overwhelming concentration of force. A typical attack on a naval target involved the following sequence. First, reconnaissance aircraft from cruisers or battleships would locate the target and transmit precise coordinates. Second, the strike force would launch from carriers 150 to 200 miles from the target. Third, the formation would approach at high altitude, 10,000 to 12,000 feet, with fighters providing top cover against enemy fighters. Fourth, as the formation approached the target, dive bombers would separate into sections of 3 aircraft each, called chutai. Fifth, each chutai would position itself to attack from a different angle, creating multiple attack vectors that prevented effective evasive maneuvering by the target. Sixth, attack would begin with the most experienced pilots diving first, following by progressively less experienced pilots. The attack sequence was timed so that bombs from the first section were impacting just as the second section was releasing, and the third section was halfway through its dive. This created continuous pressure on the target ship's anti-aircraft gunners, preventing them from concentrating fire on any single aircraft. By the time gunners tracked one dive bomber, another was already releasing its bomb. The psychological effect on defenders was devastating. Officers aboard HMS Cornwall and Dorsetshire described feeling helpless as Val after Val came screaming down in near-vertical dives that seemed impossible to execute safely. Dive bombing training was particularly intense. Pilots practiced dive attacks for hundreds of hours. They started with 60-degree dives from 6,000 feet, gradually increasing to 70-degree dives from 8,000 feet, then 80-degree dives from 10,000 feet. By the time a pilot graduated, he could execute 85-degree dives, nearly vertical, with complete control. The standard training requirement was to achieve 80% hit rates against stationary target rafts measuring 50 feet square. Pilots who couldn't achieve 80% accuracy were failed and reassigned. This wasn't optional. This was minimum standard. The dive bombing technique taught to Val pilots was methodical and precise. First, approach the target at 10,000, 12,000 feet altitude, positioning the aircraft so the sun was behind and above, making the aircraft difficult to spot from the ground or sea. Second, roll inverted when directly over the target. Third, pull the nose down to achieve 80-85-degree dive angle. Fourth, extend dive brakes to limit speed to 230 mph. Fifth, aim using the fixed gun sight mounted on the cockpit coaming. Sixth, compensate for target motion. Ships could move 500-800 feet during a 15-second dive. Seventh, release bomb at 1,500 feet altitude. Eighth, retract dive brakes and pull out of dive at 800-1,000 feet altitude, pulling 4 to 5 G-forces. Ninth, execute defensive jinking maneuvers while climbing away to avoid AA fire. This sequence required extraordinary skill. Pilots had approximately 18 seconds from rolling inverted to bomb release. During those 18 seconds, they had to maintain precise dive angle, compensate for crosswind, track a moving target, calculate lead angle based on target speed and direction, and release the bomb at exactly the right moment, all while pulling 3 to 4 G-forces in the dive, listening to anti-aircraft shells exploding around them, and preparing for the 5G pullout that would follow bomb release. One mistake, dive angle too steep, bomb release too early, pullout initiated too late, meant death. Japanese dive bomber pilots trained for 3 years to execute this 18-second sequence perfectly, every time, under any conditions. Cannon aircraft considered obsolete by Western standards, flying suicide dives that Allied pilots refused to attempt, achieve 80-90% hit rates and sink over 40 warships without losing a single plane to enemy fire? Can 180 dive bombers completely destroy a modern naval force in less than 10 days? Please like this video to see how this turns out. Subscribe for more unlikely victories, and let's continue to April 1942 in the Indian Ocean. By March 1942, Aichi had delivered 479 D3A-1 aircraft to the Imperial Japanese Navy. These aircraft equipped 6 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zukaku. The same 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. In the 4 months since Pearl Harbor, these carriers had devastated Allied forces across the Pacific. They had sunk or damaged 8 battleships at Pearl Harbor. They had destroyed over 200 Allied aircraft at various targets from Hawaii to the Dutch East Indies. They had supported amphibious invasions that captured Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. By April 1942, the Kido Butai, 1st Air Fleet, was the most powerful naval aviation force in history. But the Val dive bombers had not yet demonstrated their full capability. At Pearl Harbor, the attack had focused on anchored battleships that couldn't maneuver. Easy targets. Hit rates were good, approximately 50%, but the targets were stationary. The real test of dive bombing accuracy came against maneuvering warships at sea. That test would come in the Indian Ocean during what the Japanese called Operation Sea and the British called the Easter Sunday Raid. The strategic objective of Operation Sea was to destroy British naval power in the Indian Ocean, allowing Japan to secure sea lanes to oil fields in Sumatra and Burma, threaten India, and potentially link up with German forces advancing through North Africa and the Middle East. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, assigned the mission to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai. Nagumo had 5 carriers: Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Kaga was in Japan for repairs. Total air strength: 125 fighters, 135 dive bombers, and 86 torpedo bombers, 346 aircraft total. The British Eastern Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville, was stationed at Ceylon. Somerville had 3 carriers: Formidable, Indomitable, and Hermes. But these carriers were not equivalent to Japanese carriers. Formidable and Indomitable were new, but not fully worked up. Their aircraft were older models: Fairey Albacore torpedo bombers and Fairey Fulmar fighters, both inferior to Japanese aircraft. Hermes was the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier, commissioned in 1924. But by 1942, she was completely obsolete with only 15 aircraft. Total British carrier air strength: approximately 90 aircraft, most of obsolescent types. Somerville also had 5 old battleships, 7 cruisers, and 16 destroyers. On paper, it appeared the British had substantial forces. In reality, the fleet was a collection of old, slow, poorly maintained ships with inexperienced crews who had never trained together. Somerville knew his fleet couldn't defeat the Kido Butai in open battle. His plan was simple: avoid confrontation during daylight, use radar-equipped night bombers to strike at night when Japanese naval aviation was less effective, and preserve his fleet for convoy protection rather than risking it in suicidal daylight engagements. The Japanese sailed from Staring Bay in Celebes on March 26, 1942. The fleet included 5 carriers, 4 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 8 destroyers. A separate force under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, with light carrier Ryujo, 6 cruisers, and 4 destroyers, would operate independently in the Bay of Bengal, targeting Allied merchant shipping. The plan called for carrier strikes against British bases at Colombo and Trincomalee on Ceylon, destruction of any British naval forces encountered, and general havoc across the Indian Ocean to demonstrate Japanese naval supremacy. British intelligence, aided by American code-breaking, knew the Japanese were coming. Admiral Somerville received warning on March 30th that a large Japanese force was approaching Ceylon. He immediately put his fleet to sea, positioning Force A, his faster modern ships, and Force B, his slow old battleships, south of Ceylon, where they could intercept Japanese forces approaching from the east. Land-based RAF aircraft began intensive patrols searching for the Japanese fleet. On April 4th, squadron leader Leonard Burchell, flying a Catalina patrol aircraft, spotted the Japanese carriers 360 miles southeast of Ceylon at 4 p.m. Burchell radioed a contact report before his Catalina was shot down by 0 fighters. The report reached Colombo at 4:10 p.m. Admiral Somerville now knew exactly where the Japanese were and when they would attack. Dawn on April 5th, Easter Sunday. Somerville ordered all ships to leave Colombo Harbor immediately. 48 merchant ships scattered west and northwest. Warships sailed to join the main fleet, but 2 heavy cruisers, HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire, had just arrived at Colombo for repairs and refueling. They needed time to prepare for sea. They finally sailed late on April 4th, heading southwest to rejoin Force A at the rendezvous point in the Maldives. At 5:30 a.m. on April 5th, Nagumo launched the first strike against Colombo. 36 Val dive bombers, 54 Kate torpedo bombers configured for level bombing, and 36 Zero fighters. 126 aircraft total. The formation approached Colombo from the southeast with the rising sun behind them. RAF radar detected the incoming raid at 6:25 a.m., giving 20 minutes warning. 42 Hawker Hurricane and Fairey Fulmar fighters scrambled to intercept. 6 Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers were caught taking off and shot down immediately by Zeros. The air battle lasted 30 minutes. The RAF fighters were completely outclassed. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience. 19 British fighters were shot down. 7 Japanese aircraft, 6 Vals and 1 Zero, were lost, all to anti-aircraft fire, not fighter combat. The Val dive bombers attacked the harbor facilities and ships. Results were limited because most ships had already fled. The armed merchant cruiser HMS Hector and destroyer HMS Tenedos were sunk. Harbor facilities sustained moderate damage, but the main British fleet had escaped. The Japanese strike force recovered aboard the carriers by 9 a.m. Nagumo prepared to launch a second strike against Colombo when his plans changed dramatically. At 10 a.m., a reconnaissance aircraft from the cruiser Tone spotted two large warships 250 miles southwest of Colombo, heading southwest at 24 knots. The report identified them as cruisers. Nagumo immediately recognized this was a high-value target. He ordered the reserve strike force, 80 Val dive bombers that had been loaded with high-explosive bombs for a second Colombo strike, to rearm with semi-armor-piercing bombs for attacking warships. But rearming would take 90 minutes. Nagumo didn't have 90 minutes. The cruisers might escape. Instead, he ordered the Val dive bombers from carriers Soryu and Hiryu to launch immediately with whatever bombs they were carrying. 53 Val dive bombers from Lieutenant Commander Takashige Egusa's dive bomber group launched at 11:45 a.m. The two British cruisers were HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire, both county-class heavy cruisers displacing 10,000 tons. Cornwall was armed with 8 8-inch guns, 8 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, and multiple smaller caliber AA weapons. Dorsetshire had the same armament. Both ships were capable of 31 knots maximum speed, but Cornwall's engines were worn and could only achieve 27 knots. The ships were steaming in company, zigzagging at 24 knots heading toward the rendezvous with Force A approximately 70 miles away. At 1 p.m., lookouts aboard Dorsetshire spotted aircraft on the horizon. Within seconds, radar detected a large formation approaching from the northeast. The cruiser's commanding officers, Captain Philip Vian on Cornwall and Captain Augustus Agar on Dorsetshire, immediately recognized the situation. They were alone, with no air cover, facing what appeared to be dozens of dive bombers. Both captains ordered maximum speed, hard maneuvering, and all anti-aircraft guns to open fire the moment enemy aircraft came in range. The 53 Val dive bombers approached in formations of 3 aircraft each, 18 sections total. They climbed to 10,000 feet altitude, positioned themselves with the sun directly behind them, and began their attack at 1:16 p.m. The first section of 3 Vals rolled inverted and dove on Cornwall. The dive angle was approximately 80 degrees, nearly vertical. From the British cruisers, the attacking aircraft appeared to be falling straight down. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. 8-inch main battery guns couldn't depress enough to engage dive bombers attacking from high altitude. The cruisers relied on 4-inch AA guns and smaller caliber weapons. These created a curtain of exploding shells and tracers, but the dive bombers came through the barrage. Lieutenant Commander Egusa led the first attack personally. His bomb, a 250-kilogram semi-armor-piercing weapon, fell away at 1,500 feet altitude. Falling time, 3.2 seconds. Impact velocity, approximately 750 feet per second. The bomb struck Cornwall's aft deck, penetrated to the engine room, and detonated. The explosion destroyed one engine room and ruptured fuel tanks. Cornwall immediately began losing speed and taking on water. 2 more bombs from Egusa's section hit moments later. One struck amidships near the main mast, one hit forward near the bridge. All 3 bombs penetrated the cruiser's deck armor before detonating internally. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition and fuel ignited. The second section of 3 Vals dove on Dorsetshire. Their bombs hit the cruiser's afterdeck and midships. One bomb penetrated straight down through 4 decks and exploded in the magazine, triggering a catastrophic secondary explosion that blew out the ship's stern. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th sections concentrated on Cornwall. More bombs hit. The cruiser was burning from stem to stern, listing heavily to port, dead in the water. Captain Vian ordered abandon ship at 1:24 p.m., 8 minutes after the attack began. Sections 6 through 10 attacked Dorsetshire. The cruiser was maneuvering violently, turning hard to port, then hard to starboard, changing speed, firing every weapon that could bear. But the Val pilots had trained for exactly this scenario: maneuvering targets, heavy AA fire, multiple attack vectors. They adjusted their dive angles in real time, compensated for the ship's turns, and released bombs at precisely the right moment. More hits. Dorsetshire's bridge was destroyed. All power failed. The ship began listing 20 degrees to starboard. Captain Agar ordered abandon ship at 1:28 p.m. The attack lasted 12 minutes. Both cruisers were sinking. Cornwall went down bow first at 1:33 p.m., 17 minutes after the first bomb hit. Dorsetshire capsized and sank at 1:40 p.m., 24 minutes after the first bomb hit. Of the 1,546 officers and men aboard both ships, 424 were killed. The survivors floated in the Indian Ocean for 30 hours before being rescued by British destroyers. Post-action analysis by British Naval Intelligence determined that the Japanese dive bombers achieved approximately 88% hit rate. Out of 53 bombs dropped, 47 hit one cruiser or the other. This was unprecedented accuracy. No dive bomber force in history had achieved such results against maneuvering defended warships, but the Japanese weren't finished. On April 9, 1942, 4 days after sinking Cornwall and Dorsetshire, the Kido Butai struck again. The target was HMS Hermes, Britain's oldest aircraft carrier, and the destroyer HMS Vampire escorting her. Both ships had sailed from Trincomalee the previous day and were steaming south along Ceylon's eastern coast. A reconnaissance aircraft from the battleship Haruna spotted them at 7:30 a.m. Nagumo launched 85 Val dive bombers escorted by 9 Zero fighters at 8:00 a.m. Hermes had no aircraft aboard. Her Swordfish squadron had been sent ashore to prepare for Operation Ironclad, the invasion of Madagascar. The carrier was defenseless, except for anti-aircraft guns. When lookouts spotted the Japanese formation at 10:35 a.m., Captain Richard Onslow ordered maximum speed and hard maneuvering. Hermes could make 25 knots, Vampire could make 36 knots, but speed didn't matter when facing 85 dive bombers. The Vals attacked in coordinated waves. The first wave concentrated on Hermes. 40 dive bombers rolled into their attacks from 10,000 feet altitude, diving at 80-85 degrees. Anti-aircraft fire was intense, but ineffective. The dive bombers came through the barrage and released their bombs. Over 30 bombs hit Hermes. The small carrier, only 10,150 tons, far smaller than fleet carriers, was overwhelmed. Bombs penetrated the wooden flight deck, exploded in the hangar and machinery spaces, ruptured fuel tanks, and started fires throughout the ship. The carrier lost power within 5 minutes. She began listing heavily to port. Captain Onslow ordered abandon ship at 10:52 a.m., 17 minutes after the attack began. Hermes capsized and sank at 10:55 a.m. HMS Vampire, attempting to defend the carrier, was hit by 9 bombs and sank at 10:58 a.m. Also sunk in the same attack were the corvette HMS Hollyhock, the hospital ship Vita, and 3 merchant ships. Total time from first attack to last ship sinking, 25 minutes. Japanese losses: 0 aircraft shot down during the attack. 2 Vals were damaged by AA fire and later ditched near the carriers. 6 RAF Ferry Fulmar fighters arrived after Hermes had already sunk and engaged the withdrawing Japanese aircraft. 2 Fulmars and 4 Vals were shot down in the dogfight. The pilot who led the attack on Cornwall and Dorsetshire deserves recognition. Lieutenant Commander Takashige Egusa was born in 1909 in Mie Prefecture, Japan. He graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1930 and earned his wings in 1933. By 1942, Egusa was considered the finest dive bomber pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had flown combat missions over China since 1937, participated in the Pearl Harbor attack where his squadron had damaged the battleship USS Nevada, and led dive bomber attacks at the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942. His personal tally of ships hit or sunk exceeded 20 vessels. Egusa's dive bombing technique was legendary. He routinely dove at 85 degrees, the steepest dive angle any pilot could survive. He would roll inverted directly above the target, pull straight down into a vertical dive, extend dive brakes at 8,000 feet, and maintain perfect vertical orientation all the way to 1,500 feet. At 1,500 feet, traveling at exactly 230 mph, he would release his bomb, retract dive brakes, and pull out of the dive pulling 5 to 6 G-forces. His bomb release accuracy was extraordinary. Of approximately 80 combat dive bombing attacks Egusa executed between 1937 and 1942, he personally achieved hits on targets 68 times. Hit rate, 85%. This was unmatched by any other dive bomber pilot in any navy. On April 5, 1942, when Egusa led 53 Val dive bombers against Cornwall and Dorsetshire, he was demonstrating the culmination of 20 years of Japanese dive bomber development and 10 years of his own training and combat experience. His bomb hit Cornwall's afterdeck, penetrated to the engine room, and detonated. The ship's fate was sealed with that single hit. But Egusa didn't stop with the Indian Ocean raid. He survived to fight at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where his dive bomber group attacked and hit the carrier USS Yorktown. Egusa survived Midway, survived the Guadalcanal campaign, and continued flying combat missions through 1943. His luck finally ran out on January 15, 1944, when he was killed during an air raid on Truk Lagoon. He was 34 years old and had flown over 250 combat missions. Another notable Val pilot was Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, who led the attack on Pearl Harbor's battleship Roe on December 7, 1941. Kobayashi's section of 3 Val dive bombers attacked the battleship USS Arizona at 8:10 a.m. His 250-kilogram bomb penetrated Arizona's forward deck and detonated in the ship's forward magazine. The resulting explosion was so massive, it destroyed the entire forward portion of the battleship and killed 1,177 of her crew. This single bomb hit caused more American casualties than any other single weapon strike in the entire Pacific War. Kobayashi survived Pearl Harbor, flew at the Indian Ocean raid where he sank multiple merchant ships, and continued combat operations through mid-1942. He was killed during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, when his aircraft was shot down by anti-aircraft fire from the carrier USS Enterprise. These pilots, Egusa, Kobayashi, and hundreds of others, represented the elite of Japanese naval aviation. They weren't ordinary pilots. They were the product of the most intensive pilot training program in the world, flying aircraft specifically designed to maximize their skills, employing tactics developed through years of experimentation and combat experience. When they dove at 85 degrees toward enemy warships, they weren't being reckless. They were executing a carefully calculated technique they'd practiced thousands of times. The suicide dive wasn't suicide at all. It was precision engineering meeting expert piloting. Between April 5th and April 9th, 1942, during the Indian Ocean raid, Japanese Val dive bombers sank 1 aircraft carrier, HMS Hermes, 2 heavy cruisers, HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire, 1 destroyer, HMS Vampire, 1 corvette, HMS Hollyhock, 1 armed merchant cruiser, HMS Hector, 1 destroyer, HMS Tenedos, and approximately 40 merchant ships totaling over 120,000 tons. Additionally, Vice Admiral Ozawa's separate force operating in the Bay of Bengal sank 23 merchant ships. Total Allied shipping losses, approximately 150,000 tons. Japanese aircraft losses, 18 aircraft total, 6 fighters, 10 dive bombers, and 2 level bombers. 0 Val dive bombers were lost to enemy fighters during dive bombing attacks. The hit rates achieved during the Indian Ocean raid remain the highest ever recorded for dive bombing attacks against warships. 88% hit rate against Cornwall and Dorsetshire, over 75% hit rate against Hermes. These results were 5 to 8 times higher than typical dive bombing hit rates. Why? First, pilot training. Japanese dive bomber pilots had 2 to 3 years of intensive training, including hundreds of practice dive attacks. Second, the 80-85-degree dive angle. Steeper dives meant bombs had shorter flight time, less deviation from wind, and more kinetic energy on impact. Third, coordinated attacks. Multiple aircraft attacking simultaneously from different angles overwhelmed defenders and prevented effective evasive maneuvers. Fourth, excellent intelligence and target acquisition. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft located targets precisely and guided strike forces directly to them. Fifth, surprise. Most attacks came with the sun behind the attackers, making visual acquisition difficult. But there was another factor: the Val dive brakes. Those perforated blade structures rotating 90 degrees below the wings weren't just drag devices. They were precision aiming systems. By limiting dive speed to exactly 230 mph, regardless of dive angle, they allowed pilots to aim using fixed gun sights calibrated for that specific speed. Pilots didn't need to adjust for varying dive speeds. The speed was always the same. The sight picture was always the same. This consistency made the Val the most accurate dive bomber in the world. The Val continued serving until mid-1943, when it was replaced by the faster Yokosuka D3A Suisei dive bomber. But the D3A never matched the Val's accuracy. The D3A was 100 mph faster, carried more bombs, had longer range, but achieved lower hit rates because it lacked the Val's perfectly calibrated dive brake system. Speed wasn't accuracy. The Val proved that slow, steady, controlled dives produced better results than fast, steep, uncontrolled dives. Between December 1941 and June 1943, Val dive bombers sank or contributed to sinking: USS Lexington, fleet carrier; USS Yorktown, fleet carrier; USS Hornet, fleet carrier; HMS Hermes, light carrier; HMS Cornwall, heavy cruiser; HMS Dorsetshire, heavy cruiser; HMS Vampire, destroyer; HMS Hollyhock, corvette; USS Peary, destroyer; USS Pope, destroyer; USS Edsall, destroyer; USS Pecos, oiler, and dozens of other warships and merchant ships. Total tonnage sunk, over 300,000 tons. Total Val aircraft lost in combat to all causes, approximately 350 aircraft. Kill ratio, nearly 1,000 tons sunk per aircraft lost. The suicide dive that Western pilots refused to attempt proved to be the safest and most effective naval strike tactic of the early Pacific War. Japanese Val pilots flying 80-85-degree dives had lower loss rates than American and British pilots flying 60-70-degree dives. Why? Because steeper dives meant less time exposed to AA fire. A Val pilot diving at 85 degrees from 10,000 feet to 1,500 feet was exposed to AA fire for approximately 12 seconds. An American SBD Dauntless pilot diving at 70 degrees from 10,000 feet to 2,500 feet was exposed for approximately 18 seconds. That 6-second difference mattered. Japanese loss rates during dive attacks averaged 3 to 5%. American loss rates averaged 8 to 12%. The suicide dive was actually safer. The Val's combat record ended at the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, when many veteran pilots were lost. By mid-1943, most Vals had been replaced by D3A Suiseis in frontline carrier squadrons. Remaining Vals were transferred to land-based units, training squadrons, and eventually kamikaze units in 1944-1945. Total production: 1,495 aircraft, including 478 D3A-1 and 1,016 D3A-2. The aircraft that demonstrated how accuracy defeats speed, how training defeats technology, and how a suicide technique executed properly becomes the safest option. But the Vals story contains important lessons that extend beyond World War II. Post-war analysis by American and British naval aviation experts examined why Japanese dive bombers achieved such extraordinary hit rates. The conclusions challenged fundamental assumptions about aircraft design and tactical doctrine. First, speed is not always survivability. The Vals' maximum speed of 240 mph made it 75-100 mph slower than contemporary fighters. Western doctrine assumed this made the Val vulnerable and obsolete. But during dive attacks, the Val's lower speed was actually an advantage. The aircraft could dive at steeper angles while maintaining control. Lower dive speed meant longer time to aim and compensate for target motion. The Val proved that controlled precision beat raw speed. Second, dive brakes are more important than engine power. The Val's perforated dive brakes were considered crude compared to more sophisticated systems on Western aircraft. But those crude brakes worked perfectly. They limited dive speed to exactly 230 mph regardless of altitude, dive angle, or aircraft weight. This consistency was invaluable for accurate bombing. American SBD Dauntless dive bombers had excellent dive brakes, but they allowed speed variance of 20-30 mph depending on conditions. German Ju-87 Stukas had effective dive brakes but limited dive angles to 60-70 degrees. Only the Val combined unlimited dive angle with perfectly consistent dive speed. Third, pilot training matters more than aircraft performance. The Val wasn't technologically advanced. It had fixed landing gear that created drag. It had an outdated radial engine. It lacked modern features like retractable landing gear, self-sealing fuel tanks initially, or heavy armor protection. But it had pilots trained for 3 years to fly it perfectly. Those pilots could execute 85-degree dives with 85% hit rates. The best aircraft in the world flown by mediocre pilots achieves mediocre results. A mediocre aircraft flown by superbly trained pilots achieves extraordinary results. Fourth, coordinated tactics multiply effectiveness. Val pilots never attacked individually. They attacked in coordinated sections of 3 aircraft, with multiple sections hitting from different angles simultaneously. This prevented effective evasive maneuvering and divided defensive fire. Western dive bomber doctrine often emphasized individual initiative and independent attacks. Japanese doctrine emphasized coordination and mutual support. The coordinated approach proved far more effective. Fifth, the 85-degree dive angle was optimal for accuracy and survivability combined. Post-war testing by U.S. Navy pilots attempting to replicate Japanese dive bombing techniques found that dives steeper than 80 degrees did improve accuracy, but required extraordinary skill to execute safely. Most American pilots couldn't consistently pull out of 85-degree dives without blacking out from G-forces. The Japanese had selected their dive bomber pilots specifically for high G-force tolerance and trained them extensively in steep dive recovery. This created a tactical advantage that couldn't be replicated simply by copying the aircraft or technique. The Val's legacy influenced post-war carrier aviation development. American aircraft designers studied captured Val aircraft extensively. They incorporated lessons about dive brake design, cockpit visibility, and control harmony into post-war aircraft. The Douglas AD Sky Raider, which became the U.S. Navy's primary attack aircraft from 1946 to 1975, incorporated many design features directly influenced by the Val: large perforated dive brakes, excellent low-speed handling, emphasis on ruggedness over speed, and optimization for accurate weapons delivery rather than high performance. Today, only a few Aichi D3A Val aircraft survive in museums. The National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, displays a partially restored D3A-2. The Planes of Fame Air Museum in Chino, California, has a D3A-2 under restoration. The Imperial War Museum, Duxford in England, has wreckage from a Val that crashed in the Pacific. But the lessons the Val taught about precision bombing, pilot training, and tactical doctrine remain relevant. Modern precision-guided munitions achieve hit rates approaching 90% through technology. The Val achieved those same hit rates through human skill and perfect aircraft-pilot integration. That's the story of the Aichi D3A Val and the Indian Ocean raid of April 1942. That's the story of pilots who perfected an 85-degree dive that Western aviators called suicide, then used it to sink over 40 warships without losing a single plane to enemy fighters during attacks. That's the story of how 180 obsolete aircraft with fixed landing gear and 240 mph top speed achieved 80–90% hit rates and dominated the Indian Ocean for 10 days. That's the story of Lieutenant Commander Takashige Egusa, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, and hundreds of other pilots trained for 3 years to execute an 18-second dive sequence perfectly, every time, under any conditions. Speed didn't matter, technology didn't matter, new features didn't matter, retractable gear didn't matter. What mattered was a brilliantly designed dive brake system combined with the most intensive pilot training program in the world, creating human-machine integration that achieved results no other nation could match. The Val wasn't obsolete, it was optimized. And in the hands of expert pilots, optimized beats advanced every time. If stories like this remind you why we preserve history, hit that like button right now. Subscribe for more unlikely victories where underestimated weapons achieved the impossible through superior training and tactical innovation. Turn on notifications so you never miss these stories. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever seen an Aichi D3A in a museum. We read every comment. These stories matter. These pilots, these aircraft, these battles deserve to be remembered accurately and respectfully. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.